I've just made these sci-fi buildings out of cardboard. Only cardboard. I'm pretty excited about how this turned out, but compared to my previous fantasy farmstead, crafting free cardboard-based sci-fi terrain is a different kind of ballpark. Wanky fantasy crafting, and you can blame that troll that rubbed itself against the wall thinking it was a lady troll. Sci-fi is often clean-cut, straight-edged, or even worse, gothic, and with an unfortunate lack of trolls. But let's see how I finally got where I wanted. It's a bit of a hobby journey, to tell the truth. My life goal to play more Infinity by Corvus Belli, sponsors of this video, requires terrain. Terrain is not only for immersion in this great game, but pretty much a requirement for fun gameplay. But what should it look like? This is the first big hurdle, right? Infinity is played out in a vast environment. The human sphere contains pretty much any setting imaginable, from jungle warfare to secret operations in neon cityscapes. I could be doing cathedral with lasers-ish, rust, trash, punkish, glass and neon skyscraper reaching the skyish, synthetic cyberpunk heroin hubbish, or even Danish designer eggish, or alien slime-ish. But to craft sci-fi terrain out of cardboard, I need to know what I can make out of cardboard that looks like sci-fi. My cardboard can only do flat sheet-based shapes, for example, so a lot of designs get taken out of the equation. I started looking at the terrain included in the Infinity starter boxes. Got to love starter boxes that include everything you need to play. And this is pretty good inspiration, not only because it's also made from flat surfaces, like my cardboard, but as inspiration for the type of terrain that works well in-game. Infinity plays with elevation in mind, and full cover, partial cover, all this stuff needs to be thought of. For me, the best brainstorming, however, is just to try and actually make something. So I started with a test build. Try some shapes, try solve some problems, and see what solutions come up. I don't need to know everything from the start. Hobbying is not about knowing all, or about perfection. It's about just doing it. The hobby, that is. A rough sketch of a sort of generator building. It's kind of like the outhouse of sci-fi terrain. I use a snap blade knife, scissors, a cutting mat, a good ruler, wood glue, also called PVA glue or white glue, and a hot glue gun. My materials are regular cardboard, good for the sort of base of a structure, and serial packaging, good for a durable and paintable out-facing surface. I've also developed super cardboard, and that's serial packaging cardboard glued to regular cardboard. The two create a perfect crafting material. So let's see, hexagonal, octagonal, that kind of stuff, definitely sci-fi. Kind of illogical, logical shapes and angles. Also rounded and straight surfaces and patterns mixed. But I'm scratching my head here. The angled things really take a lot of effort. And the slightest mistakes when cutting, we need to be able to make mistakes right. But here it just makes stuff look off. Adding decorative panels from the thin serial packaging helps create a sci-fi look. Takes some work figuring out the actual shapes and measurements though. Takes time to measure and cut. But it works. But the crooked bits, it really is down to millimeter perfection. It's too much work. This is what my generator sketch made me realize. A lot of edges should be angled, rounded, or sort of hex-shaped. Decorative panels look great. And what if I add damage? Cut away the worst-looking bits, hide my mistakes by removing them, creating a reason for my imperfect measurements, battle damage, or just an abandoned vibe. The troll is back. Viva the horny troll. I can use the limitations of the cardboard to my advantage. Maybe slight cardboard-related imperfections creates a style that would be difficult to get from a more perfect material, and therefore creates a unique look. That's what I keep trying to tell myself anyway. I've still not nailed down a good construction method for making the angled corners or edges that also hides the cardboard underneath. So another piece, some shipping containers. That's kind of necessary. The Infinity Sphere is massive, and what holds everything together is trade and intergalactic transport and travel. Everything obviously needs to be packed and shipped. I figure like a skeleton or a framework that I can dress with thin serial cardboard could be a thing. Now, this is experimenting. I'm a firm believer that I will not get to where I want without trying different things along the way. There's no real point in being afraid of failure, especially not when dealing with making things out of free materials. I might lose a bit of time, but if I see my hobby as something other than a ride worth enjoying, then I'd be up to my neck in unnecessary worry about the time things take. Sometimes, however, my mind plays tricks on me. Well, a lot of the time, but this was one for the books. I thought so hard about all this that I, in fact, got it all wrong. For some reason, my 2x2 by 4 inch container frame became 1x2 by 4 inch. So back and do it right. But while on the subject of inches, I decided when making my fantasy-style buildings that using an inch-based measurement system is the way to go. But I think my inch-based intentions, well, they can be misunderstood. This has nothing to do with the fact that some French king put his foot in it. It's the visual aspect of using a measurement system that is essentially built up by something that is dividable by 2 or 4, and not as with the metric system where you divide things by 10. I hope you get it. I only use full inches, half inches, quarter inches, and so forth. It looks coherent and simplifies the decision-making process. And if I religiously stick to this system, like not only is every building based on inches, but the details too, let's say I glue on a panel strip that is half an inch somewhere on my build. Well, I place it not by eye, but a quarter of an inch from the edge, or half an inch from the edge, and so forth. This could, of course, be done with the metric system, but are you cutting 7 millimeters, or 4, or 3.5 centimeters, or 4.2, and where do I place it? For me, therein lies confusion. Or at least more effort to get something that looks right when working with flat sheet cardboard builds. I was, however, by now pretty tired of constantly measuring and constantly getting everything slightly wrong. And I had a revelation. Printing out a grid and gluing it to my cardboard. This is like the apple on the head thing, or the naked bearded man in the bath thing. If you're ever going to build something out of cardboard, this is a thing. I used a website called Gridsly, my new favorite website. It says a lot about my current interests. Having this glued on grid made cutting out panel details so easy, and to come will be so helpful it's silly when it comes to all the measurements. A few tips. If you place a printed grid on the inward-facing side of your cardboard, for me the printed side of the cereal packets, for example, remember that your cuts will be mirrored. Also, either glue the paper on real good with white glue so it sticks there permanently, or glue it on lightly so you can remove it before gluing things together. Now I've had enough experiments to feel comfortable. The panel details really make the builds. Patterns are difficult, but these are my favorites. I think building a framework is too much work. Better for the angled corners would be a thicker material. And here is the second apple to the head, the one that really knocked me out. I found double thickness cardboard. This is a box for moving your stuff when your spouse kicks you out because you've collected too much cardboard. This I can just cut at a 45-degree angle and get the angled corners I'm after. Simply put, I can just build a box, cut away the edges, and get a sci-fi box. Included in this revelation is a fact that has evaded me for too long. Cardboard thickness is measured in inches. This thick stuff is a quarter of an inch thick. The thin stuff is an eighth of an inch thick. So if you glue two pieces of regular cardboard together, you get the same thing as the thick cardboard. This means that when you, say you want to cover a visible cardboard edge with a strip of cereal packaging, I just cut out a quarter of an inch strip, easy, as I have the grid on the back, and the strip will cover the cardboard perfectly. No measurements needed. And as you can see, I'm now on a real build. The bonus of spending time on developing techniques is that my mind also gets the time to come up with some creative ideas. I now know what I'm building. Because stories help so much just to make sense of things and give ideas to what type of buildings to create. We're on the newly discovered planet Shinju. Kind of found by accident, it became the focus of attention of the power and information-hungry Infinity factions. See, there's vast remains of a prior, apparently wiped out, unknown alien civilization. The planet is not only littered with ruins of this lost civilization, but also the remains of their technology. There was an obvious rush to deploy archaeologists, scientists, and military personnel to obtain this technology, like a gold rush but with bigger guns and cool sci-fi soldiers. The initial probes of the planet's atmosphere showed that the air was breathable, maybe just a bit dusty. But a few deaths later, it became apparent that it's not. There are nanobots in the air that act like a deadly virus, breaking down tissue from the inside of humanoid, flesh and blood type species. The nanobots then spread from infected to uninfected like a virus now called the Red Fever. It's suspected that the nanobots are remnants of a military weapon used to wipe out the original alien civilization. Since then, settlements and facilities on Shinju have been sealed off underground or in dome-like facilities. But there had to be some first simple settlements, right? First outposts, out in the open, now abandoned, of course, damaged by the harsh conditions, used maybe as cover for covert operations by one of the major powers, or even as a very dangerous base for more clandestine operations like black market entrepreneurs with hidden shelters underground. This makes for a great story to build around, and I wanted this sort of habitat/research facility as the first major building. And I feel like I've cracked the nut now. I can build fun buildings and not think too much on how to do them. I've settled for a design on the sci-fi type panels that work, and that if I reuse it, it becomes a theme across all the buildings. I think I may have created sci-fi art deco, which is a pleasant surprise. And so during a weekend off, yeah, this is what my time off of work looks like. Bloody freezing. Anyway, I worked on a second building to kind of anchor my idea for this place. I call it the Black Market Bazaar, which it could be, but would originally have been a landing hub for all the goods that would have had to be shipped in, so like a docks or something. The obvious damage, not only because of big guns and bad weather, but maybe because of the inferior nature of the hasty utilitarian buildings they would have been from the start. Something that would make no sense without a story, and would be difficult to come up with without a story in mind. Now, I'm trying to purposefully have in mind what makes these various structures work in a tabletop wargaming setting, especially for Infinity. All the roofs are flat because that means miniatures can be placed there. There are protruding elements that create cover. I try to make entry points to the elevated areas, and in some cases, like the Black Market Bazaar, it's just about a lot of openings and angles that create a sense of a building while in fact not being much of a building at all. It takes up space on the table, but all that space can be used and is not blocked off or unreachable. And in terms of scale, again, I just think inches work. 2 inches a good height for a single-story building, and doing all the buildings the same height means they can be connected with walkways. What I am kind of missing, however, is some examples of small scatter-terrain type structures. So I made a few little pyramids, because pyramids are great sci-fi shapes. Apparently, Shinju has some rather spectacular hostile forms of megafauna that requires certain defensive systems. And so these could be called my salad makers, keeping you safe at night from getting eaten by the big lettuce. Or left behind terraforming things or ground research probe things, you name it, and it's probably going to be pyramid-shaped. After a black prime, by the way, you can prime in freezing temperatures. Just keep your rattle can warm in warm water, your builds and miniatures warm indoors right before priming, and if very cold, just spray a bit. Take things indoors to stay warm and then bring outdoors again for more paint. And with all my creations done, it looks pretty cool. I went from confusion to wanting to do more. This settlement can be vastly expanded, and should be for a full game of Infinity, but we all have to start somewhere. Now, as building took some time, painting is going to have to go swifter. I make sure I have every crevice, every nook and cranny black, some obvious misses with a primer here and there. Then I use a makeup sponge as my sole painting tool. The result when using a sponge is something like this. The sponge doesn't reach into the crevices, so not only is it an efficient tool for application with smooth and almost airbrush-like qualities, it also leaves behind contrasting shadows where the sponge does not touch the black primed surface, removing the needs for washes and such. I'll walk you through the process. I have a damp sponge that I dip in paint thinned with water. I dunk the sponge on a tissue to remove excessive excesses, then stipple on. I work around the build, not sponging in the same spot for too long. After probably 2 passes, I have this. I want this dark tone to cover pretty much everything but the very deep crevices. Now these 2 buildings, I thought I'd go for a warmer sort of sandy concrete. The brown has a cooler purple tint to it that would be a nice cool shade to the warmer sand color that is to come. And that following layer I try to apply a bit more sparse, leaving some shaded browner areas. The watered down paint also means a bit of the brown underneath can shine through in places overall, giving off a more weathered and textured look. Then finally a canvas, says the name on the paint. This I apply with caution, going for edges and some worn vibes in choice places. And in the end I have this, a great kind of concrete, dusty, weathered look. If we compare to the original sand-only layer, the difference is drastic, even though I was pretty delicate with my application of canvas paint. I intend to leave these buildings mostly one color. It's part wanting to be done, part thematics and story, and part wargaming table look. On the table, I feel it's nice to let the miniatures be in focus. A multicolored building can distract quite a bit from the nice paint jobs on the miniatures. And why would anyone paint these frontier structures with lavish decorations? And yes, I do want to get done. Some details should get separated, however. And for this I use contrast style paints diluted with water, just tinting the surface here and there to get some detailed distinction. I then want some kind of markings. I did experiment a bit with the placement of stripes. Yes, these are roughly 1/8 of an inch wide. Stick to the theme, remember. But I found that stripes really can mess up the visual impact of the sci-fi panel decorations. Best seemed to be to not have lines traversing from one panel to the other. And I was very tempted to do a sci-fi orange, but thought that the 012 yellow, the sort of galactic United Nations Infinity faction, looked reassuringly realistic. Then paired with a muted green or white, and I get a proper sort of official settlement look. There's nothing like creating an imaginary style, a fantasy if you will, to then anchor it in a kind of reality by using sensible colors and markings. Something else that can transform the, let's face it, kind of crude builds, if compared to plastic kits or 3D printing, into something less crude looking is to add something of high definition. I have refrained from adding high detail plastic or 3D printed bits. I want to show what we can do with cardboard only, but other options is transfers. Just one transfer here and there kind of tricks the eye into thinking we actually have some high detail happening. And another cool option would be some posters, for instance. You know, Greater Independent Japan needs you, or permanently stick it to the man, be a nomad, or careless use of your comlog costs lives. You get it. I, however, have to get my printer in order for that kind of stuff. So I settled for transfers. The numbering on the building can make them look even more kind of official. Admittedly, I couldn't resist using some of these, well, let's call them vintage transfers. It's scale modeling transfers for like oil and petrol cans from the Second World War. So my defensive pyramids are now labeled Shell. Actually a rather cool name for a sci-fi defensive system. When adding transfers, I start with a layer of gloss varnish on the surface. Add the transfer, and then once it's dry, varnish over again with another layer of varnish, in my case, a matte varnish. This means I can now paint on top of the transfer, and it's like painting on top of a layer of paint. Because these transfers are too stark white, too crisp. So I go over them with some dirty-looking transparent contrast paints to sort of blend them in with their surroundings. Finally, I go over everything with a rougher sponge with paint on, stippling on, chipping and wear. This is definitely taking places to the worn realm and is a very optional look. Especially seen close up in camera like this, it looks kind of rough, but at a few feet away on my table playing Infinity, and this is pretty cool. Now, I don't really feel the need to stain things much. Everything is already looking very worn. I did, however, add a bit of an oil paint filter. This is a bit artsy, but it was done very swiftly. I've got this very diluted oil paint, diluted in white spirit, and I add a bit of warm yellow to the sort of top of the buildings. Then do the same with a very muted dark blue at the very bottom. This kind of adds a very subtle effect of like the sun shining on the top of the building and a cooler shadow at the bottom. It was so fast to do, I just couldn't resist it. Now, of course, I could add streaks using oil paints or streaking grime, but I kind of find that this is a downward slope, a very deep hole dug under my feet. Once I add some streaks in one spot, well, it would be logical if there were streaks here, and over there, and here, and over here, and there. So I kind of settled for, I'll just do some symbolic where it's kind of most visible, and then if I feel like I want to do more some other day, I can just do it then. And things are kind of done. But what I just realized is something cool. The fact that these are made from cardboard. These are some of the coolest pieces of terrain I've got, and I've made them. There's none like them anywhere else in the world, and they cost me next to nothing. I think that's rather awesome. The worst thing, however, is I feel like I've only just begun. There's tons of other buildings that could expand this little set into a great narrative gaming table. Taller buildings, smaller things to scatter around, walkways, something, a bit more industrial looking, something habitat looking, something official headquarters looking. Even if it's the first abandoned outpost on Shinju, the different factions are still massive powers with the backing to drop quite a few prefabs and stuff in a jiffy. And by the way, I can very much recommend Infinity as a game system. I've got an introductory video if you're interested, and another video on what it's like to play the first starter set, both linked down below in the description. As a final note, I'm going to varnish these buildings as soon as the oil wash and streaking grime is cured, not only to protect them, but also to give everything the same shine. And now, I'd like to thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. Thank you to my dear patrons as well for supporting the creations of videos like these. Oh, and please check me out on Twitch. A bit of this project, for instance, was done during live streams there. Now, I'm off to Shinju. Bye.